heartily be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. Kudzai Mudzimo Mukulu. Give praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodie, African power and African liberation for all African people. This is Shakara, back after a long hiatus with another edition of the Pan-African Question, where we break down, bite-sized, questions in relation to Pan-African theory, practice and implementation. Today is the first of the month called Mosiah. Mosiah. We named the 8th month of the year after the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey, because this is the month of his birth. And so we don't call it August no more. We refer to it as Mosiah. So this is the first of Mosiah. And because it is the first of Mosiah, I thought it would be appropriate to reinstate and reinstall the Pan-African question on the question of what is Garveyism. We're going to be breaking down the primary and fundamental principles of the ideology of Garveyism. And to do that, we're going to be using the words of the prophet himself, of Marcus Mosiah Garvey himself primarily. We're going to explore the actions of the UNIA-ACL in implementing this philosophy. But because we know that the UNIA-ACL is an organization come government, and that Garveyism is a movement, we're gonna rely on and draw on the wellspring of other brothers and sisters, particularly from the time of Marcus Mosiah Garvey himself, in order to elucidate what is meant by Garveyism. So first and foremost, it's necessary to explain that what is referred to as Garveyism is more specifically within the Garvey movement referred to by two primary names or titles. The first is African Fundamentalism. African Fundamentalism takes its name from an essay that Papa Garvey wrote in 1924, and that essay became a pamphlet. It was republished in the Negro World newspaper a number of times, and this became one of the clearest ideological, most popularized ideological statements of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the most eminent prophet and king, himself, as promoted by the UNIA-ACL. All right, African Fundamentalism. The second name or title is Universal African Nationalism, which is used very often by Garveyites, and probably throughout this episode I'm going to be using Universal African Nationalism more frequently. All right, but it would be good to break down these words, each word and their definitions, to give greater emphasis to why these terminologies are used. And so we begin with African. That should speak for itself, all right? But there's a lot of confusion about that in this day and age, and that's probably going to be an episode in and of itself, except to say that when we say African, we are referring to the indigenous black people of the African continent as they exist on the African continent and throughout the African diaspora, and I'm sure most people understand what we mean when we said that, all right? And there'll be more on that a little bit later. But African fundamentalism, what do we mean by fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is defined as a movement or attitude stressing strict and literal adherence to a set of basic principles, or the practice of following very strictly the basic principles of any subject or ideology. So basically, African fundamentalism is the idea that there are certain basic principles, and values, ideas, goals, and objectives that relate to what it means to be an African in this dispensation of time, and that African life should be governed by an adherence to those basic principles, understanding the goal is liberation, of African people. Then we come to Universal African Nationalism. We've already defined African, so what does universal mean? Universal is defined as including or covering all or a whole collectively or distributively without limit or exception, affirming or denying something of all members of a class or of all values of a variable, adapted or adjustable to meet varied requirements. So as I'm sure you've realized, the word universal repeats itself in the name of the organization and the government itself. The Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, all right? And the term universal was used for various different auxiliaries of the UNIA-ACL as well, and is used for various different auxiliaries of the UNIA-ACL. So the idea is that universal African nationalism is designed to relate to and pertain to all African people as a whole collectively and work in our collective, yes, best interest. It also means, that African nationalism relates to and pertains to all aspects of our lives and can be and should be in theory applied to every area of people activity as far as African people are concerned, which means that whatever activity we are engaging in our lives should be geared towards the goal of achieving African nationalism. So let's define nationalism. Nationalism is defined as loyalty and devotion to a nation, a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others, and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations or supranational groups. A nation's wish and attempt to be politically independent. So most of those definitions speak for themselves. We are considering ourselves as African people to be a nation first and foremost, and to be about the business of creating a nation at the same time. Yes. So on one hand, the nation is conceptual. On the other hand, we are trying to make it concrete. And for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to add the definition that we use in the Al-Qaeda Revivalist movement, which is the organization that I was born and raised in. Nationalism is building and maintaining autonomous nations and communities with institutions designed to promote, preserve, and protect African lives by any means necessary. So what are the fundamental principles of universal African nationalism? Well, the foremost scholar on the life and legacy of the most honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey is a now ancestor by the name of Babatoni Martin, who is the author of this great and illuminating book, Race First, the ideological and organizational struggles of Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This book comes highly recommended for those who want a basic overview of Garvey and Garveyism, all right? But as the foremost scholar, he identifies three primary principles of universal African nationalism or African fundamentalism. And as the Al-Qaeda Revivalist movement, through our studies of Papa Garvey, we've added one, and I do say, thankfully, with the blessing, of Babatoni Martin himself. And so, the four fundamental principles of Garveyism are race first, self-reliance, nationhood, and as added by the Al-Qaeda Revivalist movement, African spiritual orthodoxy. Race first. What is race first?